Thank you, everyone, for coming here. Obviously, this is a topic which I think about a lot, and appreciate very much people taking this time. It probably interferes with dinner to come and sit here. Just a remark, Jim Campman, sitting in the first row here, is going to play a role of facilitator in that we've developed a set of different aspects of this problem that can be talked about, and he might interject a new one at various points in time. And the other thing you can do, Jim, is when somebody asks a question or says something, to repeat it so that everybody can hear it. In particular me, because I don't hear so well. So, I'm going to start off with a strange question, especially in this group, and I'm going to ask it anyway. How many people in this audience, by a show of hands, believe that climate change is an emergency? So, okay, that's not a surprise in this context. But what I want to say is that, unfortunately, despite many things that have happened, which are good, the way in which they're happening is not as if this was an emergency. That's not the rate at which we're doing things. When we talk about 2030, or when we talk about 2050, or we talk about 2100, and don't look at what we really need to do. So that's why I feel it's necessary to talk to people who already, there's not a question about whether you believe in climate change or not. It's a question of what we need to be doing when. And that's a serious issue. So I'm going to start off with just a few things which are relevant to this. I was involved with the IPCC reports that have come out over the last few years. And I've read, if I go back a few years and I read a report, and I would look at it and I would become furious because the report had so many things that weren't in it. And then finally, they did a report. The intention was to compare the difference between holding the temperature to no more than a 2 degrees centigrade increase versus holding it to a 1.5 degree. Because the commitment at the Paris meeting, which dealt with all this, was 2 degrees. And then it turned out they put the work into understanding what the difference would be, because it sounds like such a little amount, and the difference is enormous. And if you try to measure the difference in terms of probable loss of human life, it's staggering. So the question is, the report that came out, which made all the newspapers and so forth and so on, is it really a good presentation of the severity of the situation? And the answer is it isn't. So if we look at proceeding with a stepwise objective like producing zero carbon by 2050, we are taking a path which is a very serious path for several reasons. One of them is we don't really have all the tools together to actually accomplish that. So even though you see states and cities committing to it, the reality of the situation is there's technology missing that's needed in order to accomplish that. The second part of it is the IPCC reports did not attempt to deal with certain issues because they did not know how to incorporate those issues into the models they used for evaluating the consequences. And specifically, the circumstances involve, for instance, the role of methane in climate change. And there is strong historical evidence that methane was the major factor in one of the worst mass extinction that the planet has experienced. And we already knew years ago that several things were happening that were relevant to this, which dealt with the contention that the Arctic was going to warm. This was known with fairly good accuracy years ago before it really started happening. And now it's happening at a rate which exceeds what anybody anticipated. You can notice how warm it's getting in Alaska. And the consequences of it have to do with the permafrost and the sea bottom and the ocean bottom in the Arctic, because as the temperature goes up and the permafrost thaws, the bacteria in it become very active, and in their functioning, they generate methane. And there's a lot of methane hydrate at the floor of the ocean in the Arctic, and as the ocean warms and the ice clears and the temperature is absorbed by the ocean instead of reflected back by the ice, that methane hydrate comes up. So these are not factors that they could sensibly include in the simulation models. There's not enough known about them to really predict at what rate those things will happen. So this is just added on to an already underestimated effort. Not an emergency. It's not an emergency. We're dealing with something in 2050 instead of doing it in 2030. So you could say, well, they're trying to make estimates based on the idea that they want to make sure they could achieve those objectives, and they modify the objectives on the basis of an assumption about what we can achieve, which is not a philosophy which gets you to create new things that accomplish what you didn't expect. So that's kind of my picture of how I see things unfolding, and then I'm concerned about the idea that people will see the promises made by New York or California in respect to what they're going to accomplish and believe that the problem is in good hands. We're going to solve this problem. Well, it's not sufficient and they won't achieve it. So the other part of the story actually can relate to what I discovered when I started doing my work in Wellfleet. And this is the fact that there's a lot of information that we actually don't have that have to do with where the greenhouse gases are coming from. So, for instance, I needed in this survey to determine how much propane was being burnt in the town of Wellfleet. And there is no regulation that requires the companies that sell propane to provide that information. So they know it, and of course each individual knows it if they look at their bills, but there's no aggregate. So the consequence of that is I can look at the assessor's database and get an estimate for how many houses are using propane and how many houses are using fuel oil. Those are not terribly accurate because ownership changes, people change the way they heat their houses, but it has nothing to do with how much each house burns. So then you could say, in a typical climate like this, how much does a house use to heat using propane? And this is a very, very crude approximation. So this is a reality for Wellfleet. It's also a reality for the state of Massachusetts. The state of Massachusetts is committing themselves to dealing with buildings and the issue of buildings burning fuel oil and propane Things like natural gas, they have better information on because they're provided by a metering system, which is easy to monitor. But there's a lot of stuff that is just not measured, that we don't have any idea how much work would be involved of actually changing the heating systems for all of the places that do that. So that's kind of the beginning of, we are not really looking at this problem as an emergency. We are not passing regulations requiring information to be collected that is necessary to do this. And we are talking about, it's like Trump saying that well, actually, not even Trump saying, somebody who's running for Democratic presidency, candidacy, saying they're really backing dealing with climate by saying they're going to install 500,000 places where you can, recharge your cars, as if that were the major obstacle. Okay, so now I'm done with my introductory part. Does anybody have an area they would like to talk about or challenge what I said? Okay, I'm going to raise something which will generate challenges. Okay, so if we want to solve an emergency problem, we should be looking at every possible way of dealing with it. So we have a reactor that we successfully shut down. Well, the consequence of shutting down that reactor, good from the point of view of carbon dioxide, it was not. And they turn on in Sandwich a traditional gas-driven electricity supplier, and we just went in the wrong direction. I'm not saying we shouldn't shut down Pilgrim. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is, do not come to the conclusion that every nuclear reactor should be shut down. There are 100 nuclear reactors in the United States that are providing electricity. Were we to shut all of those down, what we'd invariably do is introduce a bunch of natural gas systems for generating electricity. Is that a good outcome? And then you can start arguing about, well, there are a lot of dangers associated with nuclear reactors. I mean, people know about, the reactors that have had problems, and people generally believe that I don't want to continue. I mean, I'm saying this. What do you think about making 200,000 reactors as quickly as possible and putting them all around the world? Yes.
Hi, my name is Gary Brzezinski. I come from Newton, and we're just down here for the week. But the question of nuclear power, it has actually analyzed with fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, the reason why we're even here tonight is because fossil fuels, when we use them, they have these negative externalities. They impose costs on society. And because when we sell fossil fuels, we don't internalize those costs into the price, then we all individually make bad economic decisions. And I feel like nuclear power is a little bit the same way, right? That if nuclear power were benign, and if as an industry you could internalize all of its costs, then there'd be nothing wrong with it. There'd be nothing wrong with somebody investing in a nuclear power plant and charging whatever they had to charge for electricity in order to cover the cost of building that plant, to make it secure and make sure that it wasn't decaying over time and introducing radioactive materials into the groundwater and so on. So, in general, something like Pilgrim, or any of these large plants, I can understand why somebody wouldn't want to live near a large nuclear power plant like that. But if the free market could come up with an idea, a safe nuclear power plant, then I'll bet none of us would even give it a second thought. But again, if it could internalize all its costs and not rely on government subsidies to, whether it's cover the insurance or whether it's, cover the debt or whatever it is that it takes to build how much does a nuclear power plant cost today? Is it $60 billion or something like that? I don't even know what the number is. But again, if the nuclear power industry could come up with a safe plan where they internalized all of their costs, then there'd be nothing wrong with them developing.
The problem is that nuclear power actually costs way more than, say, solar and wind by a factor of 10 after you put in capital costs, and even without worrying about the social cost of getting rid of the nuclear waste. That it's just not economical to build a nuclear power plant anymore. Los Angeles just contracted 7% of all the electricity in the city of Los Angeles at 2 cents a kilowatt hour from solar and battery. Battery is overnight 1.3 cents a kilowatt hour. Nuclear costs about 20. So it really isn't, it is not cost effective. Even existing coal plants are slowly closing, rapidly closing, because they can't compete with solar and wind and natural gas. So
Yeah, but that doesn't,
that's just the market.
that story is true in the United States. That story is not necessarily true in other places. So in both Sweden and France, nuclear power has worked out very well. In Germany, where they decided to shut down the nuclear power plants, it's been a disaster. They ended up going back to burning coal and buying electricity from France, who was generating it with nuclear power. So I'm just saying, the United States has messed up the whole thing in respect to nuclear stuff. We failed to develop a technology for reprocessing fuel rods. France was successful in doing that. Why did we mess it up?
But nonetheless, Bob, solar has now, because it's 5 years after those numbers, and Germany switched over from nuclear, solar has come down in price so much that it's much more cost effective than anything else.
It's cost effective, that's absolutely true, but that's not the only criteria. It could be cost effective, but in the situation of dealing with the grid and dealing with the fact that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, and if you're talking about northern countries where the sun is of no value whatsoever during the winter, that those sound great, but they're not universal solutions. And the battery story involves a lot of issues. Manufacturing a vast supply of batteries uses, there's a lot in that process, which in itself is dangerous, which in itself produces carcinogens, waste that is difficult to... what I want to do is say, it's easy to go along the path of saying that nuclear power is no good. But the idea that you should shut down nuclear power plants that are working well without having a complete replacement strategy for them is not smart.
Yeah, Pilgrim is not working well. Pilgrim is...
Oh, of course, I participated in all the stuff having to do with Pilgrim. Why would we want to live here with that thing at the end, and they're going to shut down the bridges and we're not going to be able to get up the Cape? But what I'm getting at is simply you have to be able to look at these pictures and not accept arguments that are being put forth that are done without considering all the factors. I'll give you another example. There was a big article printed in the New York Times a week or so ago, co-authored by one of the authors was somebody who lives on the Cape, and it talked about all of these ideas, the cheap costs and so on and so forth. At the very end of the article, it actually mentioned that, of course, what we need is a Manhattan Project to develop batteries to support this whole thing, because we don't have them. So, this is an emergency, and I don't want to say that any one of these technologies should be dismissed without really comparing all the consequences of going one way or going another. In my family, I have several people who actually work in the nuclear power industry, and I asked them what they thought of this paper that talks about the successes in Sweden and so forth. And it said, Sweden is one place, but putting reactors all over the world in places that have no experience running those reactors, no security that they can provide in respect to those reactors, you can imagine what would happen. But that's different than turning off reactors in a place where they are working and we don't have all of our pieces together for replacing them. Yes?
Well, I mean, the problem is that they're all working until there's a disaster. And I don't think that we can afford any nuclear disasters. In terms of human life, the cost of the environment, the future of our children, and the future of the planet. So it's sort of a swift, I mean, it seems so absurd and irrational to talk about nuclear power as being an option.
But what about all the places that are going to burn coal because it's cheap? And coal has killed hundreds of thousands of people. Coal has killed many, many more people than nuclear power plants.
I have to say, before I retired, I was actually in the energy business and dealing with the cost effectiveness of different energy options. One of the issues right now is, in this country and most places around the world, power plant development, whether it's nuclear or coal or natural gas, is a function of investor confidence in that particular technology. And you cannot build any power plant in this country or any other capitalist country that requires investment unless those investors have confidence that the long-term lifetime of that technology is safe and will produce a return on their investment. They won't buy the bonds. Now, in my professional experience, working with states, development of new nuclear capacity is not attractive in this country for investors. There's no money available for it because the perceived risks are so high, whether it's economic risk, whether it's regulatory risk, or whether it's contingent liabilities of some sort of accident 50 years from now. It does not attract investor interest. So what attracts investor interest now is natural gas, which is in energy conservation, and solar and wind. So in terms of environmental damage, that's maybe down the line, but the most immediate issue that prevents nuclear power development is the lack of investment interest in nuclear power. It's not like we could say, well, we want 500 plants built in the next 20 years. Are you going to invest $1 million in buying a bond for a nuclear power plant? Probably not, because there's so many risks in that kind of investment, whether it's price overruns, whether it's the volatility of price of the uranium, whether it's accidents, whether it's international policies that discourage waste disposal. It's a very, very risky investment at this point. So to some extent, I think nuclear power development is moot in this country at this time. So we're not going to go up, we're not going to solve the problem.
Good. Yes, excellent.
Well, thank you. One thing that's never talked about in nuclear energy, it's always assumed that no greenhouse gas emissions are involved in nuclear energy. That's true when the plant is up and running. What you don't hear about, and that includes even liberal media, NPR for instance, when they promote nuclear power, they don't tell you about the fuel chain from mining to refining. That whole process is very greenhouse gas intensive. And that's something else we should keep in mind, aside from the duplicity of the industry. I also have problems with free market solutions because they usually pass their costs on to citizens when, you know, when they don't make a profit. So, yeah. Thank you.
So just to keep things going in this mode, you know, what do you do with solar panels when they're old? They last for 20 years. What do you do with them? Well, and what if you have a lot of solar panels that you're trying to do something with? What do you do with them? They're toxic. There's no easy. I mean, I think the kind of thinking is right. I mean, what you said was. The other side of this is I don't think that if this is an emergency, we should look at it from the point of view of what we think is economically, you know, justified. I don't agree with that logic. That logic should not be the logic. We didn't do a Manhattan Project on the basis of making money off of it. Not that I love the Manhattan Project, don't get me wrong. But I'm saying that this is a situation where we haven't yet gotten to the level of understanding about what we have to do. And we are not, you know, when we look at trying to make this work by economic manipulation, I think it makes our minds shut off much too soon in respect to what we have to look at. And I think the whole idea about, for instance, methods of extracting greenhouse gases from the atmosphere is an example of a place where we've expected this to happen by little companies raising some money because they have an idea and experimenting with some technology they've developed that extracts greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. This is not the way to develop technology for actually accomplishing that on the scale that we need it. It should not be thought of in terms of the economic returns justify that kind of an effort. I think that's not the right way to think about how we need to develop a technology for extracting greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And the reality of the IPCC reports is that every reasonable simulation that they ran ended up doing overshoot with the requirement that you extract greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. It's in those reports, and what's been the consequence of doing that? With somebody putting a lot of money into developing this technology? That's not happening. Yeah.
I just want to say, with respect to market-based solutions, when gas went to $4 a gallon, people changed their habits. There's no denying that. I mean, I know friends took their bikes out, they started taking public transportation, people started walking more, they started carpooling. So price is a very big motivator, at least in terms of, let's say, conservation, right, for individuals and for businesses. But not only that, I think if you look at the history, you'll find that when the price of a barrel of oil goes up, investment in clean energy goes up. And when the price of a barrel of oil retreats, investment in clean energy retreats. So there's a very simple way to think about what the benefits of a market-based solution would be. That if we could increase the price of fossil fuels in the market, then we would get private investment coming in to develop, to invest, whether it's in nuclear power, whether the attractiveness of nuclear power would begin to increase under those conditions, I can't say. But if the price of fossil fuels started going up predictably, then you would see private investors coming in and you would see people changing their habits. And that's the basis of a market-based solution. So just while I'm on it, I'll tell you that I volunteer with an organization called Citizens Climate Lobby that's been working to get what's called a revenue neutral carbon fee put in place at the federal level for the last 10 years. Currently a bill in Congress, you might want to look into it. What it would do is gradually increase the price of fossil fuels every year. It would return 100% of proceeds to all households on a per capita basis. So all of the money from the fee goes back to households on a flat basis, which means that if you have a high carbon footprint, you get a check, but you don't close the gap between what you experience in energy price inflation. But if you're on the low end of the income scale, by which I mean about 60 to 70% of households, you actually experience less energy price inflation than you get back in that check. And the price of fossil fuels goes up year after year after year, and economic projections are that after 12 years, we would reduce emissions by 45% under that scheme, and grow the economy and a number of other things.
Yeah, but that's part of the problem, and it's moving slowly. There's nothing wrong in principle with the CCL idea, except that it's taking much too long for it to work.
Well, it's not working yet because it hasn't been passed.
Right.
So we could use more help getting it passed. But if it were passed, then it would actually meet the emission reduction targets required, dictated by the IPCC report in October. It would reduce by 45% in 12 years.
What price? How big would the tax on carbon be?
It would start off at $15 per ton of CO2 equivalent emissions, which would be reflected in a gallon of gas. Would be a 15-cent increase in a gallon of gas in the first year, and $10 per year every year thereafter. And if we don't meet our annual emission reduction targets, it would increase by an additional $5 per year.
I have trouble having this conversation in kind of the narrow focus of just climate change. Like, for instance, when you raise the conversation about, if you close the nuclear power plants and opening the, natural gas plants, those would be a bad substitute for the nuclear power plants. The reality is, for me, I don't think any real change is going to happen in the United States, where we need to take a lead unless we change the political climate in this country. And to look in each one in their own silos is like not helping us deal with what I also agree is an emergency. So for instance, when you talk about cutting down coal usage or natural gas usage, and you see a large population of people who are going to lose their jobs because of this, there's a lot of research that shows for just a certain percentage, small percentage of population losing their jobs, for instance, to automation or to unemployment, it swings the economy more right-wing. I mean, I think that's why President Trump got elected, that, people in Ohio or in these other, West Virginia, these other places where people are being left out of the economy, the economic growth. And so then you continue to then re-elect people like Trump, who will defy progressive policies around solar and wind or other progressive efficiency programs or whatever. So I think we just have to be really careful about going cold turkey and impacting a big swath of the population who are going to lose their jobs and be angrier. I mean, I don't know much about your program that you're describing, but I think that's one of the things Andrew Yang is talking about, giving people like a level of base income that they won't be afraid to change their way of life and then address climate change. I mean, in Alaska, the citizens get money from the economy, that's the energy industry. And I just think we have to be careful about using the word emergency so quickly to think we can have such a revolution that we're leaving out broad swaths of our population.
Well, I think the Green New Deal attempted to incorporate from what were previously around something which was definitely included a lot of social issues. And there are people who are involved in the mix between that and let's say the labor unions. The labor unions have to be part of this process that we evolve, because otherwise we won't have their support. We won't have all those people supporting us. And the thing that we need more than anything else is to get as many people behind this as possible. And I think that my notion of emergency is to say, how can we get as many people as possible pushing for the changes that need to be made? And in order to get a lot of people, we have to pay attention to the effects it will have.
That's what I'm saying.
And so what you said was perfect. Yeah, so.
Yeah, so I think one of the problems with the lack of urgency is people, the American people, do not understand how it's going to affect their lives. Like first climate change was like, oh, the polar bear is going to have a hard time. And now climate change is, yeah, there's going to be a little bit of rise in sea level, people on the sea coast may have a little trouble. But it's like every aspect of our lives, right? It's our food chain, it's soil moisture drying up. I work in sustainability and healthcare. It's asthma, it's a disease, right? Like, I mean, you guys, most of you guys in the room know that, like, American people are going to wait until they start seeing these effects and then get concerned. Like, how do we close that gap? And how do we make it not a political football? Because even if we implement something like what you're saying, as soon as Republicans get back in, it gets axed, right? So how do we get out of the political spectrum? But how do we get the American people, regardless of your political affiliation, like everyone cares about their kids and asthmas, right? So how do we make that jump from us horrible liberals to this is going to affect you and your kids and your food, not the polar bears?
I'd like to make 2 points. First, when there's a disruptive change from using coal to using renewable energy, the person who loses their job as a coal miner knows they've been disrupted. But the person who gets a job installing solar panels, I'm a hardworking guy and I got an honest job. The fact is, there are many, many more jobs in installing solar now and created each year than were ever in the coal industry, which was attacked by automation 10 years ago. So solar and renewable energies are creating many more jobs than coal is losing. But you don't know that from the politics because the guys who lose their job know it's them, whereas the people who just get a job, they don't care. They got a job. The second point is about carbon tax. Now, I'm in favor of carbon tax, but the idea that you can tax everybody and then give it back on an equal basis isn't going to work. The real effect of a carbon tax is to make more expensive technologies like solar be more attractive. As a result, the price of energy goes up so that solar is now competitive with carbon, and there isn't the money to give back because the money is going to the people who are producing slightly more expensive, greener energy. And so there is no dividend. What would happen is if the price of gasoline went up to $4, maybe electric cars would be so much more attractive that people would pay more for an electric car, and that's where the money goes. It doesn't go into an available dividend. They switch out of gasoline, but they're paying more because they're paying more for the alternative fuels. So there's no dividend to be given out, and that's what we're hoping for. The dividend is going into alternative energies that are more expensive, but greener.
You mentioned batteries in Manhattan project. What prevents us, like we had Kennedy had the NASA, get to the moon in 10 years. What prevents government, and it's probably obvious, but prevents government from funding a battery project? Or, the Koch brothers giving money to MIT to develop batteries. I mean, really, in the long term, as long-term investing, I hear a lot about investing here, and a lot of people live off dividends from power companies. Right? So that's a reality, but trying to get out of this thing, it seems to be electricity becomes the energy of the future. It's all electricity we're going to generate. That I hear, everybody says get away from carbon, but we generate electricity through carbon today. But what prevents batteries from being developed? Yeah, I mean, it's political probably, but what's your view?
Yeah, no, and if you generated a lot of electricity more than you needed via the usual grid situation, you could generate hydrogen and make hydrogen-powered vehicles. There are all kinds of things that could be done, but I think that expecting them to be done just by the operation of our capitalist economy, I think is a mistake. I think that if we look at it from that point of view, we'll never really address this as an emergency. It's not just, who can make money out of this.
Yeah, I appreciate the complexity of the discussion that seems to be largely talking about economics and bottom line, and I would at least like to appeal to that there are other values other than the bottom line, and that's the well-being of the planet and all humanity. And I know there are a lot of really well-informed, sophisticated people here, so I'm not telling you things you don't know, but I do want to say the U.S.'s connection to the rest of the planet, i.e. the global South, so whether it's Latin America or Africa, or I was listening to some Celine Cousteau, Jacques Cousteau's, I think it's his granddaughter, talk about what's happening in the Amazon being the monster of the world, and every fifth breath we take is from the Amazon, so it's not, I think it's important to debate the issues of this kind of power that versus that kind of power. But the larger issue is maybe this is about our collective humanity and and that we're actually going to have to not use profit margins or economic baselines as the issue. And the more we find out about the impact of people outside of the U.S., and I wish I had just a flood of information or concrete things. I read it and I forget it, I get overwhelmed. But I do know we're not the ones who are taking the most direct blow. And I mean, you turn on the news and all we hear is about immigration. Immigration. What's going to happen to desperate people who they literally cannot live in their homelands, and they will do anything to escape because the impact of, I was listening about Mumbai today and the floods in Mumbai. Are we going to stand by?
And we're just seeing the beginning of this. I mean, if you look at Southeast Asia,
Right.
it's going to be so hot there that you can't live there. Where are those millions and millions of people going to go? What's going to happen to them?
Can I ask what China is doing? Like they have a double or a little bit more than double our carbon emissions. Are they addressing it? Like what's going on in China?
Well, I think that China, there are two parts of China. One part of China is their effort to become the dominant economic power. And they are, in that context, facilitating things like coal plants in other countries because, it's easy to do that. And the effects of that are of course, disastrous if you look at it from a global perspective. They did a lot in China to address their immediate pollution issues with the air, but there's a lot of coal being burnt there, and and in terms of their international efforts, a very, very bad consequence in respect to how other countries will be generating their power. So that's, I mean, if you start looking at the powerful countries in the world and say, what is really driving how they are dealing with the world as a whole, that, it's like there's not a motivation based on the fact that we have an emergency that's going to kill us all. That's not the operating principle of the United States or of China. We're nowhere near that as the motivating factor. We can justify this by looking at economics. It's infuriating. The climate mobilization, which I was involved in at a very early stage, started out with a 1,000-page document that showed, analogously to what happened in the Second World War, all the changes that would have to be made to focus the country on dealing with this issue. They did it, and they were not attuned to the second phase of this, in which you started looking at how people were being affected, all kinds of people were being affected, and that being at least an equal, if not more important, understanding that you had to have in order to make these changes. We're very far from a country, we are very far away from having the mentality that's references, I mean, it's like, I don't know, I grow stuff. I love growing things. There's something so magical about taking the earth and growing things out of that earth. And it's so distressing to see us destroying all of that. But I don't know, how did these changes happen? I mean, the climate mobilization, the organization did change. They were looking at this thing from an intellectual, scientific point of view, and they were missing, a major part that they needed to have. And that's what was so exciting about the Green New Deal, was starting with that as the place to start from.
Can I raise another topic? And a lot of the problem is that everybody here knows what the emergency is and the extent of the emergency, and is just talking about different aspects of resolving the emergency. But climate change is not an issue that the general public has digested and got excited about. And one of the reasons is that it's very difficult for news media to tell the story of what the emergency is and how it will affect each individual grouping now, today, rather than in 2050. And I'm not sure if that's a failure of the drive to deal with climate change, or if it's a failure of the public to be turned on dynamically by the issues that will be facing them, rather than the issues that face them right now. They have various issues like no jobs, low salaries, things like that they face right now, or that, gun violence that they face right now, which the news media can dramatize and make people activate themselves to deal with immediately. But is there any sense of how you're talking about the dynamics of climate change? How can the news media translate climate change for the general population, not for us here today, in order to energize them and make them aware that these decisions have to be made in their own self-interest, because they are as important as gun control is in the wake of these two shooting incidents?
the news media responds to what they believe people are interested in reading. And they don't believe that they're interested in reading about climate. And it's like the politicians are, listen to the people, in their district and what have you, and those people who are coming to them by and large are people who are concerned with much more immediate problems in their lives and not talking about climate.
Just in response to your comment, I just think we have a daughter who's 20, and I also teach, and I'm just like amazed by how many people of that generation, how many young people consider this such a major issue, like not the major issue for them. I mean, the whole Sunrise News movement is that college age, young adult kind of vision around this, and they're mobilizing. They are mad, and they, I just hear kids saying they don't want to have kids because they're afraid what the world's going to be like. I think they're like actively making an impact that the Democratic candidates may end up having a debate just on climate change because of their vision around it. So I guess I feel a bit hopeful that young people in their 20s really, and younger kids, see it as their lives. And I think they think about it seriously in a way we don't. Like you were talking about methane gas. A lot of them are vegans because they see that the meat producing business in America puts out so much methane that is impacting climate. I don't know, I can't say I scientifically know the amounts, but to a very big amount. And so they're changing the way they eat. So how many, I haven't done it yet, but how many of us are making those choices down to what we're eating? Because that's just as important as talking about the power plants we're building.
Yeah, I just wanted to say in relation to the media, I think that the news media actually suppresses conversation about, especially as a millennial. And I actually, I had the privilege of going to school with Varshni Prakash, who is, Varshni, who is one of the founders of the Sunrise Movement. She's the executive director, and she, along with some of my friends, they started the permaculture at the UMass Amherst campus where we went to school. And I wanted to say, in relation to that about, I think that this is an ethical issue, and I think it really does come down to consumer choices. And I invite everyone, when we organized the Green New Deal Town Hall, we had Madhavi Venkatesan, who is the Executive Director of Sustainable Practices, speak. And she's a professor of economics at Northeastern University. And so this video, it's on our YouTube channel, but there's a direct correlation which she spells out very clearly between consumerism and climate change, where, for example, 30%, if we're talking about, for instance, we talked about the Amazon and every fifth breath, right? So 30%, Americans consume 30% of the Earth's paper. If you go to a country like Iceland, you won't find posters, you won't find, things made out of paper. And to me, one of the biggest, shocks is the amount of, talking about old growth forests, which sequester more carbon, and the fact that as we talk about these issues, to me, it's like we live in a death culture, right? Where we see these shootings, we have gun lobbies, right? The fossil fuel industry, and it's all based around profit as opposed to what is actually a green economy. A green economy is based in, growing and gardens and biodiversity. Cape Cod is such a strange place because we have so many people who have these lawns. We have and hydrangeas, and I do look, my partner and I, we work a lot with the Association to Preserve Cape Cod, and we try to do a lot of environmental programming, because the reality is if we just look at our landscapes, they're dead landscapes. Lawns not only are super dead zones for birds, for migratory birds, because they're not native species, they don't promote life. They also promote invasive bugs like grubs that destroy the trees, so they're breeding grounds for things that are actively destroying. So, talking about, a generational component or the news media, I think that the reality of it is that right now we're in an extraordinary ethical battle where you have the military-industrial complex, you have 5 media corporations which control all the news and all of the information, but at the bottom line, the real issue to me is that we've become, through capitalism, divorced from the consequences of our actions, but ultimately we are not connected to the biodiversity. And when we did our Green New Deal Town Hall, we gave out seed packets, which had a quote from Alan Leopold, who wrote a Sand County Almanac, and the quote is, "We abuse the land because we see it as a commodity belonging to us. Until we see the land as a community to which we belong, and we begin to use it with love and respect." So as someone who works at a library, I'd really like to, there are 2 books that I'd really like to recommend. One of them is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I'm not sure if anybody has read this book, but it is an incredible piece of literature. She is an ecologist at SUNY, and she really spells out what is wrong, you know, with our country, which is that disconnect from the land that we live on, the fact that we have hydrangeas, right, everywhere around, and yet those are not, you know, feeding the life that sustains us. And then the second book is by Joan Maloof, who is in Massachusetts. She also, she's an arborist, and this particular book is all about old growth forests. And so I guess that my last point, because, you know, among people, at least my own age, like, we are incredibly concerned, and it's very disturbing just to see how the media doesn't reflect our values, that we continue to be silenced. And when I went to school with Barishni, we thought, you know, we were really hopeful for something. I wrote a paper comparing the past 30 years of presidencies when Obama was president to, you know, the past 30 years of presidential policies. And in my paper, I wrote about a Green New Deal. This was in 2010, and that didn't happen. You know, if you look at like the Podestas and what they did with the green, you know, the green lobbying money, and it's just like, it never happened. So I would strongly recommend those 2 books. But also, you know, once again, I don't think that that what we see projected on a national level really does reflect what people, you know, at least in my age group and younger, care about at all. So that's all I have to say.
I've been in the energy industry my whole life, and I'm a pessimist. I don't think there's a single solution. And what it reminds me of is the years before World War II, where there was a lot of denial about militarism in Europe. It was very abstract. There was opposition to getting involved in the war. There were Americans who supported the Axis powers, and there was the feeling widespread that the Americans could stay out of it and we didn't need to build a big army. We would be fine. Okay. In fact, it was an emergency, and we needed Pearl Harbor to go. I think we're going to need a Pearl Harbor, environmental Pearl Harbor, to really wake up and really develop a political will, which was necessary for the Manhattan Project. I think we're going to need to reach a point where the consequences of climate change are so real and so undeniable that it will really become a consensus that we have to deal with it. But I don't see it happening anytime soon, because we don't want to give up our hydrangeas. We don't want to give up our $202.75 a gallon of gasoline. We don't want to give up our air travel to Europe. You know, it's too difficult. I think we're going to need a genuine crisis. We're going to need a Pearl Harbor in this country before we will change.
And then it's too late, right? Like, I mean,
unfortunately,
you can see the storms getting worse, right? Like, way worse, right, than when we were younger. You're starting to see some pretty dramatic effects, like is it the governor in Florida who's Republican, but he's like, okay, I believe in climate change now because of the storms. Like, what do you, is there a particular sort of Armageddon that you're thinking of, like that would get people's attention, like the food chain or the health care or the what would it take for the environmental?
I don't know, but I could imagine, a massive surge in international immigration. People displaced around the world clearly because of change in their availability of food or their sustainability of life in other parts of the world, kind of clamoring to get into Europe and the United States and places where they're wealthy enough that we can remove ourselves from the consequences.
Everybody in the United States is not wealthy enough to remove ourselves. Maybe in this room we are. But everybody in this country is not wealthy enough to avoid the impact of a major storm that could destroy a city, maybe that would be Pearl Harbor, or the complete fires, the dryness. People can't grow food. In the Midwest,
So
I mean, come on.
we're more protected and insulated.
We're protected also because we're so big, we don't
That's right.
relate to the other parts of the country, let alone the Africa and, Asia, etc., places where people are starving.
Will majority non-white millennials solve this issue?
What? Does that have, I don't understand.
Will the millennials solve this issue?
Why did you say non-white?
Because that's the major difference between this generation and our generation. Our generation is still majority white, and they're non-majority white, and that makes a big difference in how they view the world. And I'm asking you that from your research or people that you've talked to, is it going to be a demographic change that might give us some hope? Or that's just unanswerable?
It's answerable.
Looking at this for the past, 4 or 5 years, it comes down to a lot of the people who've been involved have in the back of their heads that nothing's going to happen until there's a major disaster. And that's a very, very, to my way of thinking, that's not the place to come to.
That's right.
That's not.
That's right.
If I may, also just Black and brown communities are disproportionately exposed to environmental toxins, waste sites, superfunds. If we look at Standing Rock, so I think in that respect, just speaking as a white person, I have found that to me the leaders that I look up to are non-white millennials.
Yes.
And I think that because they are disproportionately, their homes are being, their homes are unlivable. They're the ones that are, dramatically more exposed to asthma. And so they don't have a choice. The people at Standing Rock, they needed clean water. They didn't have a choice. And I look at, for example, the fast fashion industry, where we have, it's the third #1 water polluter in the world, and yet we have all of these people who are, progressive, and yet they go out and they buy new clothing constantly, or they do it for their family or their friends, and the reality of it is that it's like 20 garments per person that are made, but then you look at the people who are being actually, impacted by the pesticides, the water consumption, the toxins, the poisons, and it's just like, non-white people are the ones that are ultimately being affected first. So of course, I think that ultimately, millennials and younger, because they have nothing left. So to me, of course, they would be the ones to solve the problem because they're not the ones, being affected.
We have nothing to lose.
Yeah.
Two brief points. I want to go back to the question the gentleman in the orange shirt raised earlier, which is, I think if I remember your question correctly, which is basically how do we grow it? How do we grow a movement? And the thing that I understand is the single most found item is that people don't talk about climate change. People in this room do, but your friends or your acquaintances or people in the grocery store, it's primary to get the conversation started. And the other brief thing is, Pope Francis wrote an encyclical called Laudato Si, which is a care for our common world, and basically what he said is, to change everything we need everyone. And that really is a thing, is do we need to count on the media, do we need to count on the government? If we do, you know, it doesn't seem to work so far, but to really widely spread the information, everybody here going out and talking to people, to more importantly, asking people what they know, if they have any information about climate change, how it impacts them, if they have any relationships with people outside the US. Because my own experience is, all you need to do is listen to one person who was severely impacted by it, and we start caring.
You know, if Miami and Manhattan would go underwater all at once, the newspapers would run a story about it. But at the rate they're going underwater, at the rate that Greenland is melting,
That's right.
is not news. And it has to be made news in some fashion for the general population to recognize that this is an emergency that needs reaction now.
Well, I think that we have had a conversation. And thank you very much.